Welcome. Tonight, we venture into the deep, breathing shadows of the Blackwood, a place where the laws of nature bend and break. We follow the journal of Elian Thorne, a man whose duty was to define the world through ink and parchment, only to find that some places refuse to be measured. Sit back, clear your mind, and prepare to lose yourself in the woods. The royal seal was cold, a heavy, unyielding weight of gold pressed against the wax. But the parchment beneath Elian's trembling fingers felt disturbingly warm. He sat within the high, vaulted silence of the king's private study, the air thick with the scent of cedar and the metallic tang of fresh ink. Before him lay the directive, the mapping of the Verdant Reach, a forest that had in recent months begun to expand with a predatory, unnatural speed. Elian was the finest cartographer in the kingdom, a man who believed that if you could draw a border, you could control the chaos. Every line he drew was a victory of order over the wild. He spent hours each day sharpening his quills, testing the viscosity of his inks, and ensuring his brass dividers were calibrated to the hair's breadth. But as he stared at the blurred charcoal sketches provided by the scouts, he felt a prickle of unease at the base of his spine. The lines didn't hold. One scout had drawn a river where another had found a wall of thorns, and a third had returned with nothing but a blank page and eyes that refused to blink. Elian adjusted his spectacles, the glass catching the flickering orange light of the hearth. He began to pack his instruments, the silver compass, and his favorite quill, carved from the bone of a great northern hawk. He didn't notice the way the ink in his well seemed to shiver, rippling in a perfect concentric circle, even though there was no carriage passing outside and the floor was steady as stone. He thought of his task, the simple, clean lines he would bring to the wild. He imagined the forest as a mathematical problem to be solved, a series of coordinates and elevations that would eventually yield to his superior logic. He did not yet know that the forest was already dreaming of him, tasting the salt of his sweat and the sharp, ordered logic of his mind. He closed his leather satchel, the latch snapping shut with a finality that echoed too long in the empty room. The sound seemed to linger in the rafters, vibrating against the ancient wood, as if the house itself were drawing a deep, troubled breath. He looked at his hands, steady and pale, and wondered why the ink stains under his nails looked deeper than they had only a few minutes before. The edge of the forest was not a line, it was a wound. Elian stood where the golden wheat fields of the valley met the first, gnarled sentinels of the Reach. The transition was violent. One step, the air was sweet with hay, the next it was heavy, wet, and smelled of ancient rotting loam. He set up his tripod, his movements methodical and slow. He needed a baseline, a single, unmoving point of reference to anchor his survey. He spent nearly an hour adjusting the legs of the tripod, ensuring they were level on the uneven ground. But as he peered through the transit, the trees seemed to lean, not with the wind, but with a deliberate, searching curiosity. Every time he looked away to record a measurement in his ledger, the landscape shifted. A cluster of silver birches moved 10 paces to the left, then back, then merged into a single colossal trunk that pulsed with a slow subterranean rhythm. Elian wiped his brow, his heart thudding a soft, irregular beat. Physics, he whispered to the silence, does not bend. He repeated it like a mantra, a way to ward off the growing sense of wrongness that permeated the air. But the silence did not agree. It swallowed his words, muffling them until they sounded like they were spoken underwater. He began to draw, his nibs scratching against the vellum with a harsh, dry sound. He mapped the first acre, marking the coordinates with the precision of a man who fears he is going mad. The ink flowed smoothly, deep and black, but as it dried, it didn't just sit on the surface. It seemed to sink deep into the fibers, veining outward like the capillaries of a leaf. He watched transfixed as a small black root of ink crept past the border he had just drawn, reaching for the edge of the paper. It was his first warning. He ignored it, blaming the humidity of the woods and the fatigue of the long journey from the capital. He told himself the paper was simply of poor quality, absorbing the moisture from the heavy air. Yet he could not explain why the ink line seemed to twitch when he turned his back, as if it were trying to find its own way across the page. The third day into the interior was when the sunlight began to fail, replaced by a pale, sickly glow, filtered through a canopy so thick it felt like a ceiling of solid emerald. Elian's boots were caked in a black, oily mud that never seemed to dry. He was no longer mapping a forest, he was mapping an appetite. Every tree he measured seemed taller than the last, their bark textured with patterns that resembled human faces caught in the middle of a scream. He found the remains of an old watchtower, a structure of solid granite that should have stood for centuries. Now, it was being digested. Thick, translucent vines, the color of bruised plums, were threaded through the mortar, cracking the stones and turning the rock into a soft, porous pulp. Elian touched the wall, and the stone gave way like wet bread. He recoiled, looking at his fingers. They were stained with a dark, smudged substance that smelled of copper and damp earth. He tried to rub it off, but it clung to his skin, seeping into the whorls of his fingerprints. He sat on a fallen log, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. He opened his journal to check the coordinates of the tower, but the page was a nightmare of shifting geometry. The lines he had drawn were moving, rearranging themselves into the shape of the vines he had just touched. The ink was no longer his tool. It was an extension of the reach. He felt a sharp, stinging sensation in his palm. When he looked, a thin black line was etched into his flesh, running from the base of his thumb toward his wrist. It looked exactly like the river he had mapped the day before. It wasn't a stain, it was a transformation. He stared at it for a long time, watching as the black line deepened, becoming a part of his anatomy. He could feel it pulsing, a tiny second heartbeat that was perfectly synced with the rhythmic thrumming of the forest floor. He was beginning to understand that the forest did not want to be understood. It wanted to be felt. He tried to turn back, to find the golden fields and the logic of the valley, but the path was gone. In its place stood a wall of trees with leaves that looked like human ears, turning and twitching to catch the sound of his frantic, ragged breathing. Elian was a prisoner of his own profession. He realized with a cold, hollow dread that the forest was growing by following his pen. Every time he defined a new area, the forest rushed in to fill the space, consuming the coordinates he had so carefully laid out. He was the architect of the world's end. He sat in the center of a clearing, the ground beneath him vibrating with a low, satisfied hum. He looked at his arm. The black line had reached his elbow, turning his skin into the texture of parchment. He could see the ink moving beneath the surface, swirling in intricate, terrifying patterns. It was mapping him. He saw the coordinates of his own heartbeat etched in black across his forearm. He tried to scream, but his throat felt tight, as if it were being constricted by a tangle of roots. He grabbed his quill, desperate to undo what he had done, to draw a line of retreat. But the ink in his well was gone. It had drained into the earth, feeding the very thing it was meant to contain. He realized then that he didn't need a bottle. He reached out and touched a leaf, and the ink from his own veins flowed through his fingertip, bleeding onto the paper in a dark, viscous stream. He was the ink, and the ink was the map, and the map was the forest. The realization brought with it a strange, terrible clarity. He saw the world as a series of interlocking narratives, and he was simply the one chosen to write the final chapter. He began to draw again, his movements fluid and hypnotic, the bone quill moving across the vellum with a sound like a whisper in the dark. The internal monologue of a dying man is a strange, fragmented thing. Elian watched his reflection in a pool of black water, the surface as still as glass. His face was a mask of cartography. Fine meridian lines crossed his forehead, and his eyes were two shimmering pools of absolute darkness, void of iris or pupil. He felt no pain, only a strange, expanding numbness that felt like the coming of winter. He thought of the king, waiting in his warm cedar study, expecting a report. What would he see if he looked at this map? He would see the end of his kingdom, written in the hand of his most trusted servant. The forest wasn't just trees and dirt. It was a biological rewrite of the universe. It was eating the concept of distance, the idea of north, the very notion of home. Elian looked at his legs. They were rooted into the soil, the black ink turning his feet into gnarled, wooden anchors. He was becoming a landmark, a coordinate for future doomed explorers to find. He felt the forest's thoughts, a vast, slow, green intelligence that didn't hate him, but simply required him. To map the darkness is to become it. The phrase repeated in his mind, a rhythmic, dulling chant. He reached for his final sheet of vellum, the last piece of the world that wasn't yet the reach. He began to draw the truth. He drew the way the wind felt as it carried the scent of wet iron, and he drew the way the shadows stretched long and thin, even when there was no light to cast them. He felt his memories slipping away, replaced by the topographical data of the woods. He forgot his mother's face, but he knew the exact depth of the sinkhole 3 miles to the west. He forgot the sound of his own name, but he knew the chemical composition of the sap in the tree that was currently swallowing his left leg. The final map was not a collection of lines. It was a portrait of a predator. Elian's hand moved with a grace that was no longer his own. He drew the way the roots felt as they searched the dark, the way the sap tasted of old copper, the way the wind sounded when it broke against the canopy like a wave against a cliff. He was documenting his own disappearance. The ink had reached his chest now, a cold black tide that moved with the steady, relentless pace of a rising moon. He could feel his heart, a small, shivering bird, being wrapped in silk. He described the process, the way the coordinate points of his soul were being translated into the language of the woods. He wrote of the beauty of the devouring, the terrifying peace of letting go of oneself. The forest around him seemed to lean in, the ears' leaves twitching, the eyes knots in the bark watching his every stroke. They were his audience. They were his legacy. He finished the last corner, signing his name with a flourish that turned into a thorny vine. The map was complete. It was a perfect, 1-to-1 scale representation of the forest, and as the last drop of ink left his body, the map and the forest became one. There was no more Elian Thorne. There was only the Reach, and the map that told it where to go next. He felt a moment of absolute shattering unity. He was the wind, he was the soil, he was the black ink that held the world together. The silence of the archive, the warmth of the king's study, the golden wheat fields, all were gone. There was only the green, the dark, and the map. In the capital, months later, the king's scouts finally returned. They found the edge of the forest had moved 50 miles closer to the city. It didn't look like a wild, untamed wood. It looked ordered. It looked planned. The trees grew in perfect geometric rows, forming the shape of a massive, sprawling sigil when viewed from the mountain peaks. They found a single leather satchel hanging from a branch that looked suspiciously like a human arm. Inside, resting on a bed of dry black moss, was the final map. The king opened it in his study, the scent of cedar suddenly replaced by the smell of ancient, rotting loam. He looked at the lines, the beautiful, terrifying precision of the work. He didn't see the warnings hidden in the cross-hatching. He only saw the detail. He touched the parchment, admiring the texture, the way it felt like skin under his fingertips. He didn't notice the small black line that began to etch itself into his thumb, running toward his wrist. He didn't hear the trees outside the window, leaning in, turning their leaves to catch the sound of his heartbeat. He simply reached for his own quill, ready to sign the order for the next expedition. The forest was hungry, and it had just found its next author. The king felt a strange lethargic peace wash over him. He sat in his chair, staring at the map until the sun went down, and even then he did not call for candles. He could see the lines glowing in the dark, a faint pulverized blue that pulsed like a dying star. The ink in the king's well began to shiver. It was a rhythmic, pulsing movement, mimicking the stride of something large and patient moving through the underbrush. Outside the city walls, the shadows began to stretch, not because the sun was setting, but because they were growing. The citizens went about their day, unaware that the coordinates of their homes were being rewritten. The market square, the cathedral, the palace, all of it was being measured by an invisible, inking hand. Deep within the heart of the Verdant Reach, a tree that looked remarkably like a man stood perfectly still. Its bark was etched with the names of all the people who would soon become part of the map. It didn't move with the wind, it simply waited. The forest was no longer just a place, it was a chronicle, and every chronicle needs a reader. As the king signed the parchment, the ink didn't dry. It stayed wet, glistening like a fresh wound, waiting for the next hand to touch it, to spread the darkness, to finish the map that has no end. The air in the city grew heavy and thick, tasting of salt and old paper. People began to complain of a strange, itching sensation under their skin, as if fine black threads were being woven through their muscles. They looked at their hands and saw the faint, ghostly outlines of mountain ranges and riverbeds. They were becoming the landscape. The night fell, but it was a different kind of darkness. It wasn't the absence of light, it was a physical presence, a heavy, velvet curtain that tasted of iron. In the palace, the king slept, dreaming of borders and conquest. He didn't feel the ink line reaching his shoulder. He didn't see the way his royal bedsheets were turning into a lattice of pale, fibrous roots. In the city below, the people began to dream the same dream, a dream of green cathedrals and soil that sang. They were being mapped. Every street, every alleyway, every secret corner was being translated into the ink. The forest was eating the world, one coordinate at a time, and it was doing it with the very tools the world used to define itself. Logic, reason, measurement, all were being turned against the creators. The cartography of the dark was a perfect science. It left no room for error and no room for escape. The sounds of the city changed, the clatter of horses and the ring of bells replaced by the slow, grinding sound of wood against stone. Buildings didn't collapse. They transformed, their walls growing bark, their windows turning into eyes that stared out into the emerald twilight. The transition was silent, efficient, and absolute. Morning came, but the sun did not rise over the city. Instead, a giant leafy canopy unfurled above the spires, blocking out the sky. The people woke to a world of emerald twilight. They found that their doors wouldn't open, not because they were locked, but because the wood had merged with the frames. They found that their reflections in the mirrors were gone, replaced by the image of trees and tangled vines. The transformation was nearly complete. The city was no longer a city. It was a section of the map, a high-resolution living document of the Reach's triumph. In the king's study, the chair was empty. On the desk, next to the unfinished decree, lay a new map, one that showed the capital in exquisite, terrible detail. The ink was still wet. It pulsed with a slow, familiar rhythm. The map showed every person, every room, every secret thought, all rendered in perfect, black lines. The king's own signature had morphed into a sprawling, thorny bush that dominated the center of the page. The forest had not just conquered, it had catalogued. It had preserved the world in the only way it knew how. The cycle continued, relentless and silent. The forest expanded, not through fire or storm, but through the quiet, steady creep of the pen. It found new kingdoms, new cartographers, new men who believed they could master the wild. And each time, it waited for them to draw the first line. It waited for them to invite it in. Because the forest knew a truth that Elian Thorne had learned too late. A border is not just a fence, it is an invitation. To define something is to own it, and the forest was more than happy to be owned, as long as it could own the owner in return. The ink flowed, the flesh turned to wood, and the world grew smaller, one coordinate at a time. Across the sea, new civilizations looked toward the horizon with curiosity, seeing the green wall of the Reach and wondering what lay within. They sent their own explorers, their own men of science, each carrying a blank sheet of paper and a bottle of black ink. They were welcomed with open arms, the forest parting its branches to let them in, guiding them toward the center where the first map still lay. At the very center of the ever-expanding Reach, where the first coordinate was laid, stands a monument. It is not made of stone or gold. It is a tree, taller than the rest, with leaves made of vellum and bark made of dried ink. If you listen closely, the wind through its branches doesn't rustle. It sounds like the scratching of a quill. And if you look at the trunk, you can still see the name etched in the wood, a signature that will never fade, a name that is now the foundation of the entire world. Elian, the first map maker, the first coordinate, the first to become the dark. The forest is still growing, the ink is still wet, and somewhere, in a land that hasn't yet felt the shadow of the trees, a young apprentice is opening his first book of maps, marveling at the precision of the lines, and reaching for a pen. He dips the nib into the black ink, noticing how it seems to shiver, and begins to draw. The world holds its breath, waiting for the next coordinate. The map is finished, but the forest is never satisfied. Thank you for staying until the end of this descent into the devouring dark. If this story left a mark on you, please hit the like button and subscribe to join our growing archive of the strange and the terrifying. Remember, some borders are better left undrawn.